maximizing the time we have with this wonderful group, I will get started. And it's my incredible pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to CCSI, the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investments annual speaker series on investment law and policy. This year, as you know, we're doing things a little bit differently, not only in a virtual format, but we are bringing together renowned experts on some of the most topical and timely investment policy related issues that the world is facing right now. So it's my really distinct pleasure to welcome you today to our session on investment facilitation, which has so many varied policy implications and ongoing political moments and dynamics that I'm hoping we can capture in this brief time together. I'm especially, first let me also thank Kabir Dugal and Arnold and Porter for their continued support of the speaker series and allowing us to discuss these topical issues with all of you on such a regular basis. So I'm extremely grateful to Arnold and Porter and to Kabir in particular for his continued support for this series. And I'm very grateful this morning that Natalie Bernasconi has agreed to moderate today's discussion. Natalie is my go-to expert on this topic. Natalie has written extensively on investment facilitation, including annual updates on the developments for CCSI's yearbook on international investment law and policy. Natalie is the executive director of the International Institute on Sustainable Development in Europe and the senior director of the Economic Law and Policy group at IASD. So without any further ado, let me thank again Natalie and turn it over to Natalie to introduce today's panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa, for those kind words, and welcome everybody to this discussion. I'm really excited to moderate this session with this very wonderful group of speakers to discuss the issue of investment facilitation. And of course, we all know that investment is crucial for achieving sustainable development objectives. We need investment in infrastructure, we need investment to adapt to a changing climate, and we need investment to move forward to a net zero economy, just to name a few important areas. But we all know that not all investment is sustainable, and some investment can even be harmful from an environmental, social, and sometimes economic perspective. So we need to find policies that support, that promote, that facilitate investment, but also that simultaneously maximize and don't undermine sustainable development objectives. Now, investment facilitation is usually understood to include policies and tools that focus on the establishment phase of an investment. And this includes speeding up and simplifying approval processes and removing regulatory barriers to facilitate incoming investment. There are different approaches as to how investment facilitation should be implemented and how investment facilitation should be governed. Some countries have started international negotiations at the World Trade Organizations. Others prefer to approach investment facilitation entirely at the domestic level, and still others have included or are thinking about including investment facilitation in bilateral or regional agreements. At the national level, most governments are already implementing investment facilitation and promotion frameworks. And at the international level, some countries are taking a more cooperative approach, while others are looking at enforceable disciplines on investment facilitation. Now, often there is room to further develop the sustainable development lens when adopting new policies, both at the domestic and the regional and the multilateral levels. And now, today, we will have the pleasure to hear from different stakeholders on their take on the issue of investment facilitation. So let me introduce our panel. We have Nicholas Palau van Hissenhoven. He is Deputy Permanent Representative at the Mission of Colombia at the WTO in Geneva. We have Kekeletso Mashigo, who is the outgoing Director Legal responsible for international trade, investment, and dispute settlement within the Trade Policy and Negotiations branch of South Africa's Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And Keke will soon be transferring to South Africa's permanent mission to the WTO in Geneva as Counselor Economic. We also have Kinda Mohamedi, who is a senior researcher and legal advisor at the Third World Network, also in Geneva. And we have, of course, Carl Savant, who is resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment in New York with Lisa. And so we have our four speakers here with us. And I would like to address the first question to Keke. In this first round, where each speaker will have about 4 to 5 minutes to respond. And Keke, I wanted to ask you, what are your views on investment facilitation in general? At what level do you think are investment facilitation measures the most relevant? And here I'm thinking about domestic, regional, international. Keke, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much, Natalie, for the welcoming introduction. Without further ado, I think I'll just address your questions. And I'd like to start off by saying that I do think that investment facilitation is important. Firstly, because I think it improves transparency, predictability, and efficiency for investors. And I believe that transparent investment information, consistent application of rules, and efficient administrative procedures should be standard components of any country's investment strategy. Because I also believe that investment policies and actions seek to make it easier for investors to establish and expand their operations, as well as conduct their day-to-day operations in the host countries. And I think it brings administrative transparency and efficiency to the investor, thereby promoting transparency surrounding their investment related procedures. And I think that this offers great potential in creating a more welcoming investment climate through the continuous simplification and of administrative procedures. And I think that this is nothing new. This is something that countries have continuously been doing, often through investment promotion agencies to improve the business climate and support promotion efforts. However, I do think that the challenge for countries, and more specifically investment promotion agencies, is to reinvent their investment facilitation strategies and make them a key ingredient of their economic development efforts, and let it work hand in hand with investment promotion. And I think that in reinventing their investment facilitation strategies, countries have a number of options that can facilitate investment. Firstly, I think that many investment facilitation measures don't require changes to policies and regulations and can be implemented swiftly. Secondly, unlike investment incentives, many of the investment facilitation measures don't incur significant fiscal burden. And thirdly, investment facilitation incorporates a range of activities, which I believe gives countries or investment promotion agencies the flexibility to design and develop and implement investment facilitation packages and service offerings that are actually tailored to their locations, their available resources, their developmental needs and circumstances. So I believe that within an overarching strategy of improving the investment environment, investment facilitation and promotion can help increase both domestic and foreign investment and to enhance the contribution to national economic development. And I think in relation to the latter part of your question, what level of investment measures are important? I believe that investment measures are important, especially at national level. However, with that said, I'd add that many of the regulatory issues to investment facilitation may be best implemented at national level, but there may be a role for regional and international cooperation to address certain governance issues. And for instance, when it comes to regional investment facilitation, many governments have established regional development objectives and incorporate investment facilitation measures. And they also have model agreements and other initiatives to advance certain investment objectives within their regions. And these established regional platforms are also important for advancing the agreed outcomes and facilitating investment for sustainable development. But I think it's also important to note when it comes to the regional context that the international fragmentation of production and services, investors are increasingly attracted to what they get from a specific city or region. So locations within the same borders can differ greatly in their attractiveness due to varying productivity levels, skills, attributes, and other local characteristics. And I think that governments often try to attract investors to less developed regions, but their attempts often focus on national policies such as tax incentives that they offer in specific regions and less on developing, together with local institutions, sub-national investment promotion agencies, thereby taking it into account each region is unique in the way that competencies in national and regional investment networks often operate. And I think in terms of the international level, the role for investment facilitation is broader than just policies of capital importing states and among regions. And I think that at international level, facilitation measures should focus on information sharing, international cooperation, capacity building, and technical assistance. But overall, I think national investment facilitation measures are the most important, obviously supplemented or supported by regional and international investment facilitation. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Keke. And you were really very precise in your timing, in addition to your input, very interesting discussion. Also, you mentioned, just to repeat, at the end, you mentioned 3 elements that you would see at the international level: cooperation, capacity building, and technical assistance, as well as information sharing. So I'm just going to highlight that on the international front, because that is where we're moving now in the discussion with Nicholas. And Nicholas, of course, Colombia is participating in the negotiations on investment facilitation that are taking place in Geneva amongst a group of WTO or World Trade Organization members. So Colombia is part of the process looking into multilateral rules on investment facilitation. And just for those who may not know, South Africa is not yet, or is not part of that group. And so, Nicholas, you who are inside this group at this point, what can you tell us about this process, and what has happened so far, and what can you tell us is coming and to be expected? What is the group trying to achieve through international rules? Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks to the Columbia Center on Sustainable Development for the invitation, to Professor Savant and to Lisa Sachs. I appreciate very much being here with you today. In this initial intervention, I should start by saying that I fully share Kekeletso's words on the importance of investment facilitation. I want in this intervention now to provide you maybe with a more political perspective, general common ground on what and why is this all about, from the perspective of some governments that are participating on the current negotiations. The idea is to better understand why are governments doing this, and finally, why we are negotiating something like this at the WTO, and where are we and where are we going with these negotiations. The underlying idea is that FDI is good. It provides some immediate effects, such, for example, as jobs, or for example, infrastructure needs are being fulfilled by FDI, or every government knows that FDI pay taxes and allow for the tax base to grow itself. But there are also some more long-term effects, not just those immediate ones, that might be even more important than those immediate ones. First, the FDI provides hard currency to governments. You know that governments have a balance of payments, and you know that governments get some hard currency from their exports and need some hard currency to provide for the payment of their imports. So most governments that are very keen to attract FDI do so because they need to fill the gap that this balance of payments, or that this trade balance of payments has for them. FDI comes and fills that gap in order for these governments to still be importing what they need. And there's also an important effect in terms of learning abilities. FDI is also an opportunity to learn from others, to learn from companies that come and invest in a country, and to provide for development. So in general, FDI is seen by governments as key for development. They most of the discussion, the policy discussion by governments, especially in emerging countries, has been on how to promote investment. And then in the previous years, there's been a lot of discussion on the protection of investment. So most of the discussion went during the last decades on the side of promotion, and then on the side of protection of investments. Facilitation comes right in the middle of these two dimensions of the coin. Facilitation, on top of being on the middle of these two dimensions, has an important dimension, in the sense that it is where governments can also regulate what type of investment they receive. When we are talking about promotion, most what we say is just come on, come on, come on. We just need investors to come. When you are talking about protection, you say, oh, come on, come on, come on. You are feeling the pain of something that happened related to the investment. When you're talking about facilitation, you are in the special locus of the policy arena, where you can regulate what type of FDI you can have. As Natalie said at the beginning, FDI is mostly good, but it can have adverse effects. So governments regulate these policy objectives, having some regulations on the sustainability of this investment, the actual responsibility, the social responsibility, the environmental responsibility of this investment. So facilitation comes right at the middle of promotion activities and protection activities at the end of the process. Last 10 years there's been a lot of new talk on facilitation of investments. We have had this type of discussions at the UNCTAD, at the OECD, at regional and national debates. And most big developing players are interested in this type of discussions. For example, China had a key role in the initiation of these negotiations at the WTO. And I don't know how anecdotal is this, but Brazil had an unexpected key role in these negotiations as well. As you might know, Brazil has never ratified an IIA. And when the crisis of ISDS struck with the change of the millennium, Brazil was saying to everyone, I told you, and start pushing for a different alternative, for a different way of doing things. That was precisely the facilitation of investment way of doing things. So when they signed a bilateral agreement on facilitation with India and started to promote it from the BRICS, from the developing world, the trade facilitation whole idea gained a lot of legitimacy and power. So at the end, partly because promotion activities were not enough to receive all the FDI that emerging countries wanted, and partly because of tiredness and fears related to the protection of investment, a lot of governments said, okay, the perfect locus to keep doing things is facilitation of investment. And we need to do something related to facilitation of investments. So governments are very keen and they like this spot, not on the fearful side of protection, not on the tired and difficult side of just promotion, but precisely in this spot where you can regulate what type of FDI you receive, and you still are promoting the establishment of those companies in your territory. So this started to crystallize in many international forums, and at the end, finally, it arrived to the WTO. The bottom line here is that participation of we are 106 countries participating in these negotiations for investment facilitation at the WTO. The WTO tried before some negotiations regarding investment. Some of you might remember the Singapore issues and some other attempts to regulate investment in the WTO. But at the end, it was this concept of facilitation of investment that actually gained ground in the organization. Here we have countries that are developed and that are good with this type of idea, because it gives predictability and transparency for their own investors when they are exporting capital to the other countries. But it is also good for receiving or importing capital members that want to participate in the negotiation. This is seen as good for development, both in general terms for the effects of FDI, but also because some provisions of the agreement could be good enough as themselves to provide for more and better investment. So where are we now at the WTO? Well, these negotiations actually started in 2017. So we have done a lot in 4 years. But my main words, there's still a lot to do. My educated guess, and some could criticize this, but this is not a preference, but a prognostic, is that this process is halfway at the WTO. There is still a lot of negotiation to do. And as you might know, as negotiations go, after a period of expansion of Big Bang, when everyone says, I want this, and they add ideas and they add interest, then it starts a period of crunching, of deflation, of a big crunch, where countries start to feel the heat and say, okay, let's take care with this. And normally negotiations after this expansion moment come to a contraction moment. And I think that we already started this contraction moment, and we are just in the middle of it. So just to sum up and give up the floor, this is not investment promotion. This is not investment protection. This is at the middle, investment facilitation, which looks especially at the moment of establishment of FDI. It's a different animal that provides the perfect space to combine investment climate with policy objectives to attract more and better sustainable investment. In MC12, which is the WTO ministerial that occurs every 2 years, and this time it has taken 4 because of the COVID, the participating members of the negotiation will, and this will happen in December the 3rd, in less than 1 month, the members will acknowledge the progress done and will share the 3rd revision of the text and will commit to further discussions. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, and very interesting how you put investment facilitation sort of in the middle, you said. So we have we also have on investment promotion, and we have investment protection on the other hand. And of course, we know that we have many investment protection agreements, unlike Brazil, replacing investment facilitation or investment protection agreements with investment facilitation and cooperation agreements. Most countries will, of course, have investment agreements on one hand and the new investment facilitation agreement on the other. So perhaps we will have a little bit of time to look at the interaction of the two, because they cover a lot of the same issues. So that might be something we can look at later on. But without further ado, and thank you very much, Nicholas, I would like to move on to Carl Savant. And Carl, you already indicated you want to take a little longer, and Nicholas had taken a little bit longer, but I know both of you wanted to say a little bit more while laying the land, but we do have to be mindful of the time running quickly. And of course, you, Carl, have been following the negotiations in Geneva very closely. And I wanted to ask you, I know this is close to your heart, how are the negotiations integrating sustainable development dimensions in their process? And is what they're doing sufficient? And maybe you may want to start with just explaining, maybe in a sentence or two, what is this agreement about in the first place, and how would you integrate these elements? Or are they integrating these elements of sustainable development? Carl?
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Well, you're raising a very important question. And let me respond on two levels. First, on a general level, and then focused on the negotiations that are taking place in the WTO, about which Nicholas has already spoken. And the focus is on the WTO, as that's where the action is at the moment. And each time I'd like to take the SDGs as a reference point. Well, the first SDG, and perhaps not coincidentally, concerns ending poverty. That means economic growth, and economic growth requires investment. Of course, while investment is not everything to advance economic development, everything is nothing without investment. And this has been recognized in the discussion so far. And of course, investment includes FDI, as FDI on balance contributes to economic growth and development. And not surprisingly, therefore, all countries, and especially the developing countries, seek to attract foreign direct investment. I think it follows that actions that in a reasonable manner seek to facilitate the flow of foreign direct investment is a good thing if you want to reach the first SDG, namely ending poverty. And as Keke said, most investment facilitation efforts have taken place at the national level. Not surprisingly, therefore, developing countries, which after all are most interested in reducing poverty, drive the negotiations of an investment facilitation agreement for development at the WTO. They want more FDI to help them advance the development and reduce poverty. So let me turn now from this general level, which applies to any international agreement that deals with investment facilitation, to the specific level of the negotiations in the WTO, and your specific question, Natalie, of whether these negotiations sufficiently integrate the sustainable development dimension. My short answer is a qualified yes. Let me explain. And that means we have to look at the draft agreement as far as it is immediately relevant to this question, focusing specifically on sustainable FDI for sustainable development. Well, it is proposed that the preamble of the agreement explicitly recognizes the importance of investment in the promotion of sustainable development, economic growth, poverty reduction, job creation, expansion of productive capacity, and trade. And importantly, in the body of the agreement itself, it is proposed that members recognize the importance of foreign direct investment for the sustainable development of their economies and the achievement of the SDGs. I think, but I stand to be corrected, and maybe Nicholas can do that this is the first time that a WTO agreement explicitly recognizes the importance of sustainable development, and not only in the preamble, but in the body of an agreement itself. Not bad, I would say. Moreover, it appears to be agreed that the agreement will have as one of its 7 sections a separate section entitled Sustainable Investment. I think this is the first time that the concept of sustainable FDI has been recognized and accepted in any international investment agreement. Not bad, I would say again. The section of sustainable investment, in turn, explicitly provides that each member shall encourage investors to voluntarily incorporate into their business practices and internal policies internationally recognized principles, standards, and guidelines of responsible business conduct. And the instruments referred to include the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy, and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and Related Due Diligence guidance. And these standards, as we know, address areas such as labor, environment, gender equality, human rights, community relations, and the rights of indigenous people. Again, not bad, I would say. Finally, the agreement foresees that developing countries may choose the pace at which they choose to implement the various provisions of the agreement. And this implementation is tied, importantly, to the availability of technical assistance and capacity building. These are provisions that are particularly important for developing countries, and in particular the least developed among them. And if the trade facilitation agreement is a precedent, and I think it is, then one can expect that substantial amounts of technical assistance will be made available for capacity building. And I think that's very important. So, Natalie, I think that an investment facilitation for development agreement makes quite a contribution to advancing the objective of facilitating sustainable FDI for sustainable development. Could the negotiators do more to advance this objective? Yes, they could. And that's why my answer to your question is a qualified yes. Let me just give you a few quick examples of what could be done in a stronger way and what additional measures could be included. As Nicholas said, the negotiations are still ongoing and perhaps some will find their way into the text. For example, the provision on responsible business conduct could be made stronger by not only asking investors to incorporate certain conduct standards in their business practices, but also to observe them. The facilitation of supplier development programs and hence linkages between foreign affiliates and domestic firms could be encouraged. By the way, supplier databases seem to have been accepted, and I think that's important. The concept of the recognized sustainable investor has been proposed by one WTO member, but has not been included in the text. Members have suggested to add home country measures to the agreement. That is, home countries should commit to do certain things to facilitate sustainable FDI, at least to make transparent what they are doing. It's not clear to me if that proposal will fly. Going beyond what WTO members have suggested so far, at least as far as I know, one could also suggest that the agreement could incorporate a provision encouraging green FDI for obvious reasons coming out of Glasgow. So, Natalie, yes, more could be done to encourage sustainable FDI for sustainable development. And until the negotiations are concluded, there may still be opportunities to do so. But then, as we know, politics and negotiating international agreements is the art of the possible. Given that, I think developing countries should be congratulated on moving the negotiations process forward, and they should be congratulated on what they have achieved so far. They will be able to build on that, I think, if and when the WTO Investment Facilitation Committee has been established. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carl. And just, of course, there are already references to sustainable development in the WTO agreement, just to double on that. Yes, so you mentioned a few provisions that are not binding, but that could potentially contribute to sustainable development in your view, and that more should be done. And of course, unfortunately, we can't really talk about the text in detail because the texts are not public in these negotiations. So I think that is very useful information on what we could do in the future and what we could ask for. Because we do know that a lot of the obligations right now are, of course, more on the developing countries who have to do more to comply with the agreement than developed countries who are the capital exporters in general. So I would like to move now to Kinda. And Kinda, you are also following the negotiations in Geneva very closely. And I'd like you to maybe follow up on some of Carl's points and look at what you think, how the investment facilitation framework actually does or does not enhance or facilitate investment for development from that perspective. So Kinda, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, thanks for the invitation. As you say, unfortunately, the text is not publicly available, but there's a leaked text on bilaterals.org from July, which is called the Easter text, Rev 1, among the delegates. And my comments will be based on this text, but also my comments, as I understand, will apply to the latest text, Rev 3, just based on conversations with delegates here in Geneva who are involved in this discussions. I would attempt to disagree with the argument that the text and the direction of travel in the current negotiations would actually deliver on the promise that it's a framework of multilateral rules that would enhance investment facilitation for development. This promise is failed in multiple approaches in crucial elements in the text, which we consider as public interest organizations does not align with developmental considerations. I'll give you a few examples. There's a lot of examples, but just a few. So everything we need to consider in regards to this framework needs to start from the scope. And as it is crafted now, this is a very broad agreement that extends very broadly to cover all investments in all sectors, services and non-services over the whole cycle of the investment from establishment to potential disposal. And there were discussions on also covering pre-establishment phases, but as I understand now is not the current direction. It will cover measures affecting or relating to investment, so basically not directly governing the investment. And the approach to measures, as we understand from WTO law, particularly under the GATS, which is also adopted under the approach of this framework, is very broad. It covers any form of measure, law, regulation, rule, procedure, administrative action, and it could extend to just non-legal undertakings by the government. It also extends to multiple levels of government, so to local governments in terms of the obligations. Now, the definition of investment is still open. There's multiple proposals. There is an asset-based definition taken basically from all style investment protection agreements, and there's an enterprise-based definition, which is much more restricted to mean enterprise or a branch of an enterprise. There is very difference. There is a big difference if you go one way or the other. If you go to asset-based definition, we know from the experience of IIAs that this will fundamentally clash and be in tension with the dynamic linkages with development that a government would want to undertake. So generally, the premise that the framework and the scope of the framework now puts in place is that all investors and all investments are to be treated in the same way, irrespective of their impact on the host country and the affected local communities and the developmental objectives generally. So this is the first thing which probably is problematic because it extends across the whole text and influences the whole operational part of the text. If we look at MFN, there's multiple issues being still open under MFN, starting from who the benefits of this framework will extend to all potentially the WTO members or non-participants in the framework, or only among the participants, potential participants in the framework, or adherents or parties to the framework. But also there are multiple other questions. So for example, what is to be covered and what treatment could be imported under this MFN? You see, if we are with this broad scope, we are basically covering a multitude of measures, including measures specifically pertaining to linking investment to development issues, and that could be questioned in this under this approach. There is also the issue of likeness. They mention likeness under the MFN now, but they don't qualify it, and this is unlike what we have learned from the IIAs, that we actually need to be more specific if we are talking about a developmental objective, to talk about, to clarify likeness, particularly with the implications on development, on third persons, on local communities, on including on the particularities, for example, of the investment, etc. Also, the issues pertaining to MFN would apply in relation to what level of government. We have multiple levels of government here that are being covered under the framework. If we're gonna leave it open, then the MFN provision could be utilized to require comparison of treatments across different levels of government. So, this would basically play against the possibility of certain levels of government taking certain considerations because of their developmental context, historical or cultural or environmental specifications, etc. So this is another area where we see issues. A third area, for example, is the multilateral disciplines that are or standards that are being proposed under Section 3 of the text, pertaining to disciplining measures relating to authorizations of an investment. For example, as we know, a country might want to set up an authorization system for certain investments in certain sectors, particularly because they would want to ensure certain developmental considerations, other public interest considerations, etc. So now the disciplines that are being proposed is that these measures shall be based on objective and transparent criteria, and there are other disciplines pertaining to the procedures to these measures. These issues, these standards, you know, they are going, the only time when we are going to completely understand how they would impact the policy space of governments and the regulatory space of governments is if they are applied in a case, because that is the point where their implications on the context and the case will reveal itself. But objective, for example, is a standard that could mean not subjective, could be used to challenge regulation that is based on the subjective balancing that is required when multiple criteria are taken into consideration in assessing an investment, such as, for example, a mining investment, a power plant, a drilling platform, etc. This basically would undermine the authority and restrict the regulatory space of the national authorities to undertake this subjective balancing exercise between the different interests they need to set in place. So this is another place where we see there are multilateral standards that are being proposed as if they do not potentially clash with the developmental interventions that a state might take. Now, just to close, when it comes to talking about the good issues, when it comes to, for example, what we heard from Mr. Sauvant pertaining to the section on sustainable investment or the encouragement of states, the language now is shall, but like in the end, it talks about voluntary approaches by businesses. This is not enough to balance out the challenging implications coming out from the other sections of the text as we see them. And we totally agree with you that they could be definitely strengthened. But still, even if they are strengthened, they would not solve the issues that are emerging from the other sections and which fall in tension with developmental considerations. And here I want to say that some of them are actually problematic. So for example, on this section on sustainable investment, it talks about that members should encourage investors to undertake and maintain meaningful engagement and dialogue with indigenous peoples. This falls short of the agreed international standard of pertaining to free, prior, and informed consent. We're not talking about meaningful engagement and dialogue anymore. We're talking about free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to indigenous peoples according to internationally agreed standards. So it would be really a problem if WTO will gonna, or like something new, even if it's not gonna be a WTO instrument, will fall short of those agreed standards. Thanks a lot. Sorry for taking more time, maybe.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Kinda. I think that everybody is very excited about this. So everybody's been taking a little bit more time, and I had wanted to do 2 rounds of questions, but it'll be quite difficult to do that because we only have 12 minutes left. But thank you very much for those much more technical, I think, insights into the text. And I guess what you're saying is that on the one hand, you have disciplines, you know, telling countries how they need to implement the agreement. And then on the other hand, some of the provisions that Carl was mentioning that are weaker than those disciplines. So is what you're saying. Now, we really have very little time, so it's not going to be another round for you know, where you can expand a lot. But I did want to go back to Nicholas and just, you know, I was going to ask him whether there were some issues still open in the negotiations, some challenges that you're facing in the negotiations, and maybe now you can build on what you've heard and just respond very quickly in a minute or so to that question and anything else you might want to say vis-a-vis your colleagues who've been discussing these issues with us today. So Nicholas, yeah, what are some of the issues that you saw arise that are still a little bit difficult to overcome? And, you know, maybe you want to take reference to some other interventions.
Thanks, Natalie. And thanks for all the comments that have been said today. I want to be completely frank. The biggest challenge we are facing with this negotiation, it's from outside the negotiation itself. What does that mean? If this type of investment facilitation negotiations happened in a void, there would be a lot of discussion in the sense that Carl was proposing. Is the corporate responsibility going in the right direction? Is the indigenous provision in the right direction? Should it be strengthened or should it be weakened, etc. But most of the discussion and the biggest challenges of the negotiation are not on the text or the drafting text itself, but on the interrelationship with other agreements. Probably 90% of our discussions happened in that scenario of the interrelationship with other agreements, and especially with IIAs. But not just IIAs, also with the other 16 agreements of the WTO. Because in this scenario, when this investment facilitation comes and goes to the floor and there are 3,000 BITs behind it, a lot of things might happen. So most of our challenges are in this part. And for example, what Kinda said on the scope or what Kinda said on the MFN are related to this interrelationship with the BITs. Because normally at the WTO, we talk about state-to-state dispute settlement. And when a commitment is broken, a full process of dispute comes, and at the end, the concerned country should reform its programs or see potentially some commercial measures. If there is a mix with BITs, would be not just states to states, but private investors against states, would be money involved and not just policy decisions, and would be not just prospective to the future, but also regressive to the past. So there is an extremely high challenge there, and there is a challenge in those provisions related to the scope or to the MFN. Just to finalize, none of those has been finalized. The negotiations are ongoing. For example, in the example of the scope, there is a preference for enterprise-based investment already on the table. It's, for example, on the MFN, there's no agreement yet on having it as part of the agreement. It could be that the agreement doesn't have an MFN, or that the agreement has an MFN curtailed or moved in a lot of directions. So just to end, the problem is not the framework itself, but the relationship with the other.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I guess we have to do another webinar just on these interrelationships. I think there have been some. Carl, you can respond very briefly. I only have 7 minutes, and I do want to get back to Kinda and Keke also. So, and you've taken a little bit more time first, so I have to be strict. Sorry if I have to cut you off if you get too excited.
Absolutely. And I will just say a few sentences. Just to underline one thing that Kinda said, it's clear the agreement will cover the entire life cycle of an investment. And that makes implementation considerably more difficult than in the case of the trade facilitation agreement, because it deals with all the ongoing interrelationships between an investor and the host country. And I think, therefore, the technical assistance and capacity building aspect of the agreement is extremely important. And I think we all should emphasize that and try to encourage countries to make firm commitments to do substantial technical assistance and capacity building in terms of implementing the agreement. Many develop. I better stop before you cut me off.
Sorry about that.
No, you're right.
Thank you. That's a good transition to Kinda. I'm giving back to Kinda and then going Kinda again. I need you to be a little bit short because I want to give Keke the last information.
Just quick messages on 4 quick issues. On the interaction with investment agreements, thanks for bringing it up. We see that it's one of the major challenges. And we see that there has been a lot of work on what you are calling as negotiators, the firewall. But we still see, legally speaking, and given the way the jurisdiction of arbitral tribunals is decided, it will be very hard for you to achieve the objective of stopping the potential filtering of the IIF into the IIAs, or being commitments under the IIF framework being questions under ISDS. You might be able to do the other way around, to block the filtering of IIAs into the IF framework or interpretations from IIAs into the IF framework, but it will be very hard to do the other way around, at least, and we can go into details, but this is our assessment. On the other thing on SND, I completely agree, this is very important. The model of the TFA is adopted, but it all boils down to transition periods. Transition periods are not enough to deal with the regulatory implications that potentially will arise from the kind of disciplines that are currently being proposed, taking into consideration this could change. So we need much more here, and technical assistance and capacity building, I would just underline, are not guaranteed. We have a challenging experience from the TFA thus far in terms of materializing of this TA and capacity building. And the last thing is just to, okay. Respect that.
But you responded to your two previous speakers, perfect on the interaction, perfect on the capacity building. So thank you for that. But I want to go back to Keke, who we heard from at the very beginning, and now we're going back. You have maybe 2 minutes, Keke. I'm very sorry. You know, as I mentioned, South Africa hasn't joined the investment facilitation negotiations, but you're quite active at the domestic level, as are actually probably all countries, very active on trying to make it easier to invest in their countries. But also at the regional level, you're active. So maybe you want to say something about that in 2 minutes, and then I'm going to have to wrap up. And I did check, I didn't see any questions in the chat, so I just stayed in this group. So I hope the listeners will be okay with that. KK.
Okay. Thanks, Natalie. Yes, we are not participating in the investment discussions at the WTO, but we are very active at the national level and at the regional level. And I think for us at the regional level, we've tried to ensure that working with other countries, there are model agreements that we have in place, and there are other initiatives that we undertake to advance certain investment objectives within the region. And I think for us, these established regional platforms are also important for advancing any agreed outcomes and facilitating investment for sustainable development purposes. But as you say, also at the national level, I think we've undertaken various policy reviews and policy reforms, and have a one-stop shop to facilitate investment. And we also interlink investment facilitation with investment promotion, because I don't think the two can be divorced from each other, although they are quite distinct. And at the national level, we also do a lot of collaborative work with the investment promotion agencies, firms, civil society, and academics, because we believe that this is a multi-stakeholder process, and it ensures that everyone is involved, everyone has buy-in, everyone takes responsibility for the decisions that are taken at a collaborative level. And we try to ensure that as a collaborative team, we identify and implement country level reforms. And I think that's where I'd like to end it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keke. And as I was saying, there were no questions. I did see a question just come up, but unfortunately, we cannot answer this question by Milena Motola. So please, speakers, you may want to check it out, and please feel free to contact Milena, contact the speakers if you want to follow up on a question. I guess a lot of the issues that Keke just raised at the end, it's also about, you know, what do we do in terms of cooperation versus disciplines? What do we do at the different levels, at national level, regional level, and so forth? A lot of questions with respect to capacity building, which of course is already taking place. I think many institutions are already building capacity on investment promotion, investment facilitation, including UNCTAD, OECD, the World Bank. So I think that countries can really already take advantage of those services. So I want to thank all the speakers. I think this discussion is not totally come to an end, because it's only the beginning of a discussion. We'll see. We heard from Nicholas. We're about in the middle right now, and we have a long way to go. So let's see, keep in touch. A lot of challenges in this context, but a lot of interesting discussions to have. So thank you very much. And thank you so much for the Columbia Center for allowing me to moderate this incredible group. And have a wonderful day, evening, afternoon. Thank you.